Hey everybody, let's talk about tote screws.
All right, y'all, I'm just going to kind of free associate a little bit and just talk about and cover some of these different totes and especially the hardware that goes with them. So as far as brass barrel nuts go, these are the most common ones that you're going to see. You've got these, what I call solid brass ones right here, and then you've got the hourglass style. So we're talking, say type 5, type 6-ish, up through type 11. And then what I've seen is that during type 11 is when we swapped over from the solid over to the hourglass. And then I just want to kind of bookend that a little bit with, this is going to be your earlier one. Believe it or not, they were taller like that on these earlier totes. And if you look, and you compare it side by side with some of the later ones, you can see that there's, a marked difference in that shape. But you got the taller ones there on the one side, and then the much later ones that Stanley produced were actually this style right here. And in the interim, if we really want to, get into the weeds, even among these hourglass ones, you've got this common shape that you're used to seeing, and then you've got this one. So this is kind of a type 19, type 20 kind of time frame, and you can see if you look real close that there is a difference there. And for example, this base is a little bit smaller, which makes it a little bit easier to go in. And so on the topic of these brass barrel nuts, and especially as they relate to the tote screws, they're pretty forgiving, both the nut and the screw. If you've got one that's got some rust and stuff on it, you can hit that with a wire wheel or whatever your method of choice for removing rust. But these are pretty forgiving, and even if they're kind of chewed up a little bit, they're still typically going to work with you. So that one right there is pretty chewed up. You can see those threads. And for the most part, these brass barrel nuts are pretty forgiving. This one is not being very forgiving right now. So let's put that little guy aside for later and we'll come back to it. But that one right there is kind of chewed up a little bit on the ends too. But you can see still pretty forgiving. So as long as you've got a clean barrel nut with some decent threads and then a relatively clean screw, and the threads don't have to be great, it's gonna work with you. If you're coming to this video or coming to the channel from the short, welcome to Just Plain Fun. And what I talked about in that one is if you have a bent up tote screw like this, it's really not the end of the world. You can still use it. You just install it first and then just slide your tote over the top of it and you can make that work. So that was kind of one of the tips and tricks. And then now we're going to talk about some other things to know about these. But before we do that, let me go ahead and cover one other one. I talked about the brass barrel nuts, but they weren't always brass because during World War II, when brass was predominantly going to the war effort, they had all steel bolts on both the knobs and the totes. And this is actually not rosewood either. This is a hardwood. It was pretty common during Type 17, but not exclusive. I've talked about that in some other videos, but in case you're new to the channel or just new to hand planes, just know that when you see that steel bolt, you're talking Type 17. However, it was still the same 1220 thread, and we'll talk about taps and dies here in a little bit. But for the purposes of this, just know that it's not always brass. Now, if you have one that's bent, and let's say you can't get it to work using the just install it method, or maybe just you knowing that it's bent is going to bother you, there are a couple different ways that you can straighten these out. This is fairly soft metal, and I'm sure someone's going to come in the comments and they're going to yell at me and they're going to say, you have to heat it up, or that's not the best way, or something like that. But you can hold it up and you can go a little tappy tap tap and you can straighten that thing out. You can get it straight enough. I didn't do a whole lot of tapping there, one because it's loud, and two because it's just for demonstration purposes. But if you've got, whether it's a large anvil or a little jeweler's anvil like this one, or whatever you might have, as long as you got that flat surface, even like the square flat part on your vise, you can use that and you can go tappy tap and you can straighten these bad boys out. And speaking of vices, it looks like I've kind of abused mine and I should probably knock that off. But you can, this is another option. You can put it in the vise, try and find the spot where the bend is, line that up with the top of the vise. It doesn't have to be this style of vise, it can be any style. And again, the metal is fairly soft, it bends fairly easily. And so you're just going to set it in there and then you're going to give it the old tug there to straighten it out. at least within tolerance, because remember, you're just looking to get it flat enough to where you're going to be able to install it. If all else fails and you just can't stand it, or it's not working, or whatever the case, by all means reach out to me, because I do sell these. By themselves they're going to be $5 each, but when you buy them with something else, they're going to be $4. Or if you're willing to buy one that's not in perfect condition, maybe even less than that. So if you need one, by all means let me know. Here's that one that was not being very forgiving, and it was not accepting of the brass barrel nut. These are 1220 dies that I have, and I do actually sell these. I sell these taps and these dies. So same. Look me up, jplainfun@gmail.com, or find me on Facebook, Just Plain Fun, the parts division. Again, I do sell these taps and dies, and I'll even give you a little discount if you buy one of each. As you can see, I've got my airplane propeller here. We're ready for takeoff. Of course, you don't want to go in dry. You're going to want to add a little bit of lube there to keep everything moving as it should, keep everything lubricated, and then we're going to do our thing. Kind of showing off some goodies here, but let me circle back to this Type 17 real quick. I don't know if it's because it's hardwood and not rosewood or what, but it is very common for these Type 17s over time for that hole to get worn. I think the steel screw versus hardwood, not a good combination. So it's pretty common to see that washer in there as a shim in order to pull that little screw up, make it work a little better. And incidentally, if you have another vintage tote, you may end up wanting to put a washer in there as well in order to bring that brass barrel nut up there even or level with the top of the tote there. And that can also come into play when you see some variance in the overall height. I don't know how well you can see that, but the overall height of the brass barrel nut can come into play there as well, and you may end up needing to use a washer in that instance too. I do have some eye candy here in the background. As you can see, these are totes made by Corinth Tool Works, and at the risk of this video sounding like some kind of ad or something, I am a part seller, so of course I'm gonna try and sell my parts here. If that's something that you need or want to put on your plane, especially these scrub planes that I'm fixing to be selling here pretty soon, by all means let me know and we will make that happen. And here's another important little FYI. This is a later bedrock right here, so of course it's held in with the pins and screws, but the tote screw right there is the same size as is the knob. And when I say same size, I mean it's the same. It's the 1220 there for the threads for the tote and knob. And incidentally, on say a Bailey pattern like this one, same deal. Those frog screws are also the 1220 as well as that. So it's a decent investment if you wanted to buy the tap and the die. Especially if you restore a lot of planes, it can be beneficial to have that particular tool set on hand. And then the number 5 here, of course, is going to have that forward tote screw. Anybody want to guess what that size is? It's 1220 as well. And incidentally, I know I mentioned this in a video before too, but in a pinch, if you didn't have that forward tote screw, but you had an extra frog screw, you can take that frog screw out and it'll work just fine as a tote screw, whether permanently or semi-permanently or even temporarily if you just need something to get by. But again, for the purposes of taps and dies, not a bad one to have on hand. I know I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, so y'all just have to forgive me. But if in the 1990s, if you were to find a Stanley catalog and order parts because they were still making them, then you would have gotten something like this. Remember I talked about this brass barrel nut being the later style. These actually came with a washer for a shim. So Stanley knew what they were doing. But if you were rebuilding the plane in the 90s and you had, say, this old vintage rosewood tote like this, look at that. It's a perfect fit. And then again, they provided that washer where if you needed it, great. And if not, that'd be fine too. But yeah, new old stock that Stanley was producing. Another important note when you're talking about the number 4.5, 5 and up, not counting the 5 1/4, it's a lot of times just going to be this narrow or smaller hole right here. It's going to be a little less forgiving for a bent screw. So if you had one that was bent on the end like that one, it's going to be a little less forgiving. Whereas on your number 4 size, number 3, number 4, you're typically going to have this larger opening like that. And those are a little more forgiving if your screw is bent. That's a little more stuff you should know. And then on the topic of these taps and dies, remember I said that I sell these 1220s. The ones that I have are the taper like that, which means they're not a bottom tap. You can see where it tapers there at the end, and that just means that it's not going to bottom out in the screw hole for you, and unless you were to, say, grind off the bottom of it or otherwise dull that. But it does go in there fairly far, and my experience with it has been that if you're going to have some chewed up threads, it's probably going to be the threads up near the top. And so it's going to be a pretty effective tap for you. But I just bring it up in the interest of full disclosure. If you do decide you want to replace something, just let me know. As you can see, you got lots of hardware available. 3 and 4 screws, and then your larger size. Some people say the large and the small, which works too. But there is some variance in the lengths on these, as you can see, depending on how old the Tote is, how much forward lean it has. But I've even got some of these new old stock screws in that I just got. So shout out to Brad if you happen to be watching this. But yeah, solid brass, hourglass brass. I got what you need. Just let me know. And that, my friends, is a wrap. I think the main takeaways here are I've got you covered, whatever you need. And hopefully you found some of that information useful.